Hi, everyone, and welcome to the U54 Partnership Research Design and Analysis Course Seminar. As many of you know, I'm Carol Lowenstein, the director of the RDAC, and I'll be moderating today's seminar. As many of you know, we hold a number of seminars primarily scheduled during the academic year. We aim to highlight topics that are methods focused, as well as to provide tools that will assist in the research being conducted throughout the partnership. Each seminar is recorded, as is today's, and posted on the partnership website. If you haven't had a chance at some point, please do take a look at the past seminars and reach out to the presenters with questions, anyone seeking advice, ideas for future research, etc., collaboration. Folks are definitely there to help. In terms of housekeeping, I'll monitor the chat if questions come up, and we'll pause intermittently to see if there are any questions as we go along. We are pleased to have Dr. Isaac Chui with us today to talk about using modified Delphi panels. Isaac is an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a palliative care physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. His research focuses on improving care for seriously ill patients with concurrent substance use disorder, evaluating and implementing digital health applications, i.e. telehealth and artificial intelligence, to improve palliative care delivery, and developing novel quality measures in palliative care. He recently received a mentored patient-oriented research career development award, a K-23, from the National Institute on Aging to develop a patient-reported experience measure that measures goal-concordant care among seriously ill older adults with multimorbidity. We've had the pleasure of working with Isaac in the Survey Corps. Anna has done some work with him, and particularly on this project, and so we thought it would be really good to have him share his expertise. So Isaac, I will let you take it from there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carol, for that introduction. And so today, the topic of today's talk is the Delphi technique and variations of that. And as you can see just from the title itself, the Delphi technique is especially helpful when you're looking to create consensus around a topic when there is either no evidence or there is no consensus. And so the objectives of today's talk is to define what the Delphi technique is. It's to list key methodologic criteria to report when you are publishing a study that utilizes the Delphi technique, and also just how to, and I'm just going to also explain, like, how do you design and conduct a Delphi study. I'm hoping that by the end of the talk that the listeners today would be able to accomplish these objectives in their own research as well. So this is basically kind of the ideal situation when you're trying to utilize the Delphi technique. Basically, as I mentioned before, there's really nothing, just a wasteland of evidence, or people just can't seem to agree about any one thing regarding a topic of interest. And so what the Delphi technique does is it basically it gets people together to achieve consensus on something. And so this is from Mad Max. I don't know. Actually, no. Yeah, this is from Mad Max. And so anyway, that's a random aside to a movie that I think most people have forgotten about. But moving forward, so the Delphi technique, where did it come from? So this was first created by some researchers, Dr. Dalkey and Dr. Helmer, at the Rand Corporation in the 1950s. And so they basically coined this term in order to create a convergence of opinion among experts within a specific topic. There's also the citation at the bottom right-hand corner in case you're interested in looking up the original article. And so there are a couple of characteristics that are specific to the Delphi technique. So the first thing is that participants who are a part of this type of study, they have to answer a series of questionnaires. And these questionnaires also obtain the participants' feedback. And so they obtain the feedback in a very structured way in what we would say just rounds. So the feedback is iterative. They're asked very specific questions, and they're also asked to provide very specific feedback. And the whole purpose of this iterative process is to give the participants the opportunity to reassess their initial judgments, to change their minds, to modify their initial thoughts if needed, as they're trying to achieve consensus around a specific topic or issue. The other characteristic of a Delphi technique is anonymity. And so the purpose of this is to reduce group conformity, because as you can imagine, even if you have a group of people who may have differing opinions, it's human nature to try to want to be liked or to socialize with your colleagues. And so the anonymity reduces sort of that sway that the group can have on an individual's opinions and thoughts. And finally, there's typically a quantitative component to a Delphi technique. And this basically ensures that opinions of each person is accounted for, I should say, as basically an equal member of the group. And so not one person's opinion necessarily has greater weight than another. And so we'll go into a little bit further detail. So these, this table, I should say, is a collection of consensus methods that one can undertake in a research project. So just going through the left column, or the very first column. So there's an informal group that you can basically get a group of people to come together, come up with an opinion. There's also a consensus development conference, and those are very similar because they're both face-to-face. What I would say is that the Delphi technique is very similar to the nominal group technique. And the nominal group technique, really the only difference between the two is that the nominal group technique is a gathering that happens in person, whereas a more traditional sort of Delphi technique, you omit that face-to-face gathering in order for people to maintain their anonymity, in order to provide their feedback and their thoughts and their opinions about something. Some other sort of key aspects of the modified Delphi technique that I've already kind of previously mentioned is there's like a mailed questionnaire component, private decisions are elicited, there's a formal feedback regarding group choices, and it's, as I mentioned, a structured interaction. And the way that one basically comes to consensus is in a very sort of explicit way. Now, the one thing I also wanted to point out is underneath the nominal group technique, in this particular study, they called it the RAND technique, but it's also known as the modified Delphi technique. And really, the modified Delphi technique is a Delphi study, but there's also the ability to meet face-to-face. And so sometimes you'll hear this, this term modified Delphi technique as a way to describe a Delphi technique where you have the opportunity to meet face-to-face as well. So that being said, you're going to see in the literature, if you decide to do this type of study, you're going to see the term modified Delphi technique a lot, and you'll just see Delphi technique. And I remember when I was looking through the literature before I conducted my study, I was wondering, like, well, what's really the difference? So in a classic Delphi technique, the iterative feedback usually occurs through 2 to 3 rounds. And the first round is usually a qualitative open-ended aspect where there are questionnaires that are sent, or there are interviews perhaps to develop sort of the initial statements, the statements that are going to be judged or evaluated. And then rounds 2 or 3 is when you would send out the questionnaires that are quantitative in nature. And basically you would then try to develop, or you would score the responses so that there's a central tendency and measures of dispersion to aggregate the data. And so I found this really nice review article on the modified Delphi technique, or the Delphi technique in general. And the way they said it was that anything that deviates from the classic Delphi is essentially coined the modified Delphi. So I know I mentioned earlier the modified Delphi was kind of like, well, that's where the face-to-face happens in addition to the anonymous sort of feedback portion. But in general, when you're looking through the literature, there's so much variation in terms of how people conduct this modified Delphi method. It's really anything that just sort of deviates from this classic format that I just described in the previous slide. So to be even more concrete, this is just an example. Again, this is using that narrative review article that I mentioned in terms of the steps. So typically, before you do anything else, you do some sort of literature review, could be formal or informal, and just to get some background knowledge about the topic that you're hoping to explore. During this process, you'll be able to identify the experts that you would want to involve in your specific project. You define them, then you would identify them, then you would recruit them. But also you would utilize this literature review to kind of fine-tune what the problem is, and then possibly even using it to develop the questionnaire. And then from there, you would sort of do those iterative rounds, as I mentioned, and get feedback and just kind of do this over and over again until you're done. And so as I kind of, you can kind of sense a theme here, sort of like wilderness, wasteland, wild, wild west. And this is really just to reflect the fact that there are so many different ways to publish the modified Delphi in terms of what's being reported and what's not being reported, that people just sort of publish whatever they want. And so someone actually did a systematic literature review to essentially come up with best practice in order to report a Delphi study. And I found this paper to be extremely helpful. It was published in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology in 2014. And again, as I mentioned, the reason why this was published was that definitions of consensus in Delphi studies are, they vary widely and are poorly reported. Attainment of consensus actually is infrequently used as a criterion for ending a Delphi study. Some people just say, we've done 3 rounds and we're just going to stop. And they don't say why. And also it's be able to create some criteria for other researchers like myself and you all listening today in terms of like what really should you be reporting in your publications. So in this particular study, they had 4 parts of their quality assessment, whether or not the study specified their stopping criteria, were their planned number of rounds specified a priori, were the criteria reproducible in terms of selecting participants, and also whether or not there was criteria for dropping items at each round. So in other words, you can't just drop an item randomly. It's like you actually have to define why you drop that particular item. Again, kind of a busy slide, not really interested in reporting all of the sort of characteristics of the studies included in the systematic review. Just wanted to highlight a few things. Most of these studies were published in North America or in Europe. It really does focus mostly on medicine-related publications. And as you can see, the number of rounds, the majority of them were conducted either within 2 rounds or 3 rounds, which is kind of like, what you would mostly see in the literature. And the number of participants, that's also another thing. There doesn't seem to be a magic number for how many participants you should include in your expert panel. It kind of just really depends on your topic, and like practically speaking, like how many experts are there available, and also just kind of like what your goals are of the study. And so this next table basically then kind of reports some of the findings. So the majority of the studies that were included, they did try to address consensus. Most of them did define consensus, but at least a quarter of them didn't. Was the definition of consensus made a priori? Most of the time it was. And was consensus reached? Most of the time it was. And what was the reason to stop the Delphi? Most of the studies that were included just said, after we finish the set number of rounds, we're just going to end the study. And so this table here is basically the many different ways that you can define consensus. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but if you ever are trying to figure out like, well, how can I define consensus in my own study? This is a very helpful table to kind of see what's been done. But I will point out that the method that's most commonly used is percent agreement. So 80% with the same rating or more. And that makes sense because that's a very simple way to define consensus. Something that I will talk about in a little bit more detail, because we utilized it in my study, was the RAND criteria. On hindsight, I probably wish I picked the less complicated way of doing it, but I'll explain to you why we picked the RAND criteria for my study in particular. And just finally, kind of sort of wrapping this study up, essentially, if you can just look at the quality score items in total at the very bottom of the table, you can see that very few studies actually had all four characteristics of high quality Delphi publication methods. And most of them did have some, but very few of them had all. And I won't go through this table line by line, but again, as I mentioned to you before, this publication by Diamond and colleagues, I think is a very good reference article to have so that when you are publishing your own Delphi study in the future, you'll basically use their table 6 as a checklist. And that's essentially what I did for my study as well. So as you can tell, I'm a big fan of movies, which is why I keep referencing movies. And so we're going to move out of sort of the hypothetical world of, papers and like, how do we do this? And let's talk about it. And let's move into reality to kind of say, well, when we get our hands dirty, what is it like? And what do you really think about? And so now I'm just going to go ahead and describe the study that I conducted. This was with the help of Anna, as well as, or Anna Rivette, Dr. Anna Rivette and Dr. Dan Gunderson, who participated in helping me design the study. And what you're seeing here is just really a slide that's supposed to represent the opioid epidemic. And the reason why I bring this up is because, as Carol mentioned, I am a palliative care clinician, and I practice in the outpatient setting at Dana-Farber. And when I first started my practice, I noticed that there were an increasing number of patients with concurrent opioid use disorder who also have advanced cancer. And for those of you who are familiar with the oncology population, opioids are a mainstay of cancer pain management. However, it gets exceptionally tricky when the patients also have active opioid use disorder. And at the time when I did this Delphi study, there were 0 guidelines about how to manage these patients. And so we basically had to ask, our colleagues based on their own experience, and essentially everyone was just making it up as they went along. It's like, well, we'd use methadone this way. No, we don't prescribe buprenorphine because it doesn't work for pain. And so no one really knew what they were doing. And that kind of was very distressing to me because I'm like, I'm a data-oriented guy. I would like some guidance around this. And so what we did was that we focused specifically on primary addiction medicine skills for hospice and palliative medicine physicians. And we did a modified Delphi study to kind of help us come to some sort of consensus around like, well, if I am a board certified palliative care clinician, like what skills should I have sort of in my back pocket when I'm taking care of patients with serious illness? And so that was the question we wanted to answer. So the expert panel that we assembled for this particular study was that we wanted to make sure that our experts were, in an ideal state, both hospice and palliative medicine board certified and addiction medicine board certified. But as you can imagine, that's a pretty small subset of clinicians in general. And so we also just, recruited palliative care clinicians as well as addiction medicine clinicians, but they had to have some experience with sort of I guess the other sort of like subspecialty in some way or shape or form. We sampled across clinicians and researchers who are, educators. They did research potentially. Maybe some of them really were just sort of thought leaders in this area, but they don't do research. And we also wanted to make sure that we sampled broadly across the entire country and not just oversampled in like the Northeast, for example. And so we ended up getting a pretty good amount of folks for our study. We ended up having 18 panelists, 50-50 in terms of male, female. Majority of the clinicians, or the panelists, I should say, were white. But in terms of regional distribution, it was pretty good. And I won't go into more detail, but as you can see, we just wanted to make sure that we had different types of panelists in order to provide a very multidisciplinary opinion on this specific topic that's very, very tricky. And so what we did to start off the study was we did a literature search, and specifically, as an internist, I already know that there are some references available for internal medicine, specifically for family medicine doctors as well, about like, well, in that care context, in primary care, like what are some addiction medicine skills that these clinicians should have? So we looked at the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and we also looked at the provider's clinical support system for essentially these skills that have been described in other aspects of medicine. And then we organized them according to the ACGME core competencies of medical knowledge, patient care, communication, professionalism, and systems-based practice. And we organized it in that way so that when we feed them to providers, it's kind of clear like what bucket these skill sets fall into. And what we ended up doing was we used the RAND scale. It's also called the UCLA definition, RAND/UCLA definitions of appropriateness. And it's a 9-point Likert scale. We modified the scale a little bit in terms of the language, but essentially 1 represents not at all, 5 represents somewhat, and 9 represents crucial to include as a skill that hospice and palliative medicine training should be able to know or to master. And the way that this rating system works is that there are several components to it. There is one component of appropriateness, and then there's also a component of sort of the level of agreement. So something that's deemed as appropriate, or skill, or an item that's deemed appropriate, it should have a median score between 7 and 9 among the panelists. And the level of agreement should be that they agree. And I'll explain to you what that means in a second. The next level of appropriateness would be uncertain. So that's if you have a median score between 4 to 6, but the level of agreement doesn't really matter. Or if you have any median score, but clearly the panelists disagree. And the level of appropriateness as defined as inappropriate is having a median score of 1 to 3, but the panelists do agree on sort of the median score. And so what agreement basically means is just kind of looking at the dispersion of the scores. So if you have a bunch of panelists who are, less than 22% rated outside that 3-point range containing the median, so in other words, they're sort of like clustered in a specific part of the scale, then that would be a signal that they are agreeing. And disagreement was defined in this study anyway as sort of being at the end. So basically rating outside that range, and basically rating sort of at having greater than 33% of people who rate sort of in the 1 to 3 range, and also having greater than 33% rate in sort of the 7 to 9 range. So kind of having this, I would say maybe like a bipolar sort of distribution of scores. And so this is just the general outline of what happened, and sort of how many skills we ended up including and we actually didn't exclude anything. We just sort of rated them accordingly. So we've originally had 53 skills that were generated from our literature review. We did 1 round of the Delphi, and during that round, the panelists could also introduce other skills that they thought were important that we may not have included, and so we added 9 new skills. 44 skills were rated as appropriate, and so therefore those were kind of pushed off to the side. We did another round again, and then we rated the 18 skills that were left over. 8 of those, after kind of reading other people's responses, 8 skills were rated as appropriate, so those were kind of shuttled to the side. And then we just did 1 final round And then we rated the 10 skills, and only one of those skills was rated as appropriate. So at the end of the 3-round approach that we chose to do, we had 38 skills that were rated appropriate with agreement, 15 skills that were rated appropriate with indeterminate agreement, and 9 skills that were rated with uncertain appropriateness. And what matters here, I think, and specifically in our study, well, actually for this table, I just wanted to highlight one thing. It's just to kind of give you a sense of like, for that group of appropriate addiction medicine skills with indeterminate agreement, as you can see, the scores basically are all greater than 7. So they were all seen as essentially as appropriate, but they couldn't come to agreement as to like how appropriate these skills are. And you can tell by basically the interquartile range for each of these items. Now, here is sort of the interesting part. I mean, I think when I look back on this study, what really I think was helpful wasn't so much the skills that were deemed as appropriate with a high level of agreement. It was looking at the skills with uncertain appropriateness. And specifically, I'm just going to highlight one skill, which is prescribing buprenorphine or Suboxone to support recovery from opioid use disorder. This is a really controversial topic in our field because it's the same argument of like, is this really in our ballpark, or should we rely on our addiction medicine colleagues to be doing this? But at the same time, we're actively prescribing opioids. And so the one thing that was helpful, and we published on this, was we were able to just get a sense of why people felt one way versus the other. So what you're seeing here is a table that describes the clinician comments on buprenorphine prescribing, why they support it versus why they don't. So essentially, the people who support buprenorphine prescribing, I'll just read one example. You don't have to be an addiction specialist to treat opioid use disorder, just like you don't have to be a palliative care specialist to treat pain or have a goals of care conversation. So essentially, these clinicians felt like this is part of your wheelhouse if you're prescribing opioids. In terms of the physicians who did not support buprenorphine prescribing, I'll just read to you one example here. Let's see here. I think this one. This one kind of splits the difference. I think fellows learn to use buprenorphine for pain and should learn how not to use it for pain. I think of this like methadone. I learned how to use it for pain and divide the dose. I know to avoid daily doses. I know it may help with cravings. I don't know, and don't use as a medication assistant. So in other words, they're saying, you should be able to use buprenorphine to treat pain, but you don't necessarily need the expertise to be treating their substance use disorder. So this is an ongoing conversation in our community, but I think this kind of just highlights the type of dialogue that we've been having as a subspecialty that also sort of was reflected in the comments by these panelists. And so, I mean, I mentioned sort of what the Delphi technique is, what modified Delphi technique is. So I'm just going to kind of go over some of the shortcomings and weaknesses of the Delphi technique in general. So one huge risk is that you can have low response rates. So if you don't really know the panelists that you're emailing, they may not email you back. And that's just a reality of any survey-based research. It can be time consuming. I mean, I felt like we made pretty good time. Like we were able to complete the study in less than a year. But still, it takes a lot of time to do this because of the iterative rounds. Even though the Delphi technique, and in our study, we didn't have a face-to-face portion, you can still sway each other's opinions. And so there's never a situation where you're completely sort of protected from that possibility, but just sort of acknowledging that it can still happen in the Delphi technique. And the final thing is that the whole point of this technique is not only to achieve consensus, but it's really to kind of get deeper what the underlying issues are, perhaps. But the problem is that you're rating statements, like you're rating these like one sentence blurbs. And so sometimes you may not necessarily go as in-depth as you would like to, depending on sort of the process that you've decided to utilize and also the topic itself. So just know that some Delphi techniques may end up just, being skin deep. and that's just as good as it's going to get for certain studies. So I just wanted to pause right here and see if anyone has any questions about what I've presented thus far. So yeah, so I'm here to answer any questions you might have.
So I had a quick question, Isaac. Did you incentivize the panel members? Like provide an incentive? Because I mean, it's time on their part, but also you want to keep them engaged so they go through the multiple rounds.
That's correct. So I did not, because this was an unfunded study, and so I just did it. And we try to pick people because the senior author on the study, she is both a palliative care clinician and addiction medicine specialist, and she's published a lot in this field. So we try to identify people who we thought would be passionate enough about the topic to be able to participate actively.
Thank
But
you.
I agree. Yeah, having remuneration is always a good thing. Like I participated in a much more sort of in another Delphi study that ended up in a higher impact publication, again on this specific topic, and they provided remuneration. But the other thing too was that their study was like much bigger than ours. We only had 18 people, and they were funded. Any questions on, I don't know, just maybe sort of more, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward technique, I have to say. It's not like it's rocket science. I feel like a lot of like any research, like the thing with this technique is just kind of the decisions you make along the way. And so navigating that was a little bit tricky, but fortunately, at this point, I was a pretty new researcher, but the senior author was pretty experienced, and so I felt like we had a good back and forth, and we're very consistent with our decision making.
I feel like a lot of people are a little intimidated by this, um, because it is a little out of the realm of what people would tend to use. They'll do focus groups or interviews, or they'll do a survey, but when you bring this up, it's sort of, oh, I don't know. I think one of the benefits of this presentation is you broke it down so that it makes it much more tangible, and it seems like it's something that you can use and should use.
I totally agree with that. And I think part of the reason why it's intimidating is because as I mentioned, there's so much variation in how you actually conduct this type of study. Like sometimes you have 4 rounds, sometimes you have 2 rounds. What's the right answer? What type of consensus methodology do you use? So I mentioned this, but I don't think I actually answered my own sort of or I didn't elaborate on this point. Like, why did we choose the RAND UCLA method of appropriateness? It's because based off of what I saw in the literature, that seemed to be like the most quantitative. Like I wanted to have as little room for subjectivity, and I wanted to do things in the quote right way, that it felt like if I was being as, structured as possible in terms of how I'm defining all of these different aspects of consensus, then that is the best method. But as you can see from that systematic review, like people do it in all sorts of different ways. And I think what matters less is not so much the type of scale you use, but really two things. Does your scale make sense? Like, is it actually logical to use in this situation? And B, like, can you justify the use of that scale? If you can do those two things, doesn't matter what scale you actually use. And so I think what makes, hopefully what makes this methodology more approachable to researchers is to know that as long as you adhere to the core components of what the Delphi technique is, then then you have a Delphi study. Like that's it. Like it's really just about organization, and it's just about making sure that you find the right people and you're asking the right questions on that specific topic that you're hoping to further explore. Um, so yeah, I hope that's helpful.
and you had it published. And sometimes when using a technique like this, that's a little bit of a hurdle too. I know that Anna has spoken a lot about how to get straight up qualitative research published, and it's not always as easy as you would think, because most people gravitate to quantitative data. They want bigger samples, sample sizes. But it seems like you were successful in this, as others have been.
And I think, and this, I feel like this is just the reality. It's that for me, I think the reason why this, and I actually got accepted pretty quickly. Like, I mean, I had to do some pretty major revisions because one, okay, actually, this is something worth mentioning. So, so first of all, to kind of comment on that issue is that this topic is seen as a topic that causes a lot of distress for oncologists and for palliative care clinicians alike. And I think anyone who takes care of this population understands how difficult it is to manage these patients. And everyone is kind of annoyed that there is no structured guidance around this topic, except use your best judgment. And because of that, and because of the dearth of literature, that's why I think this publication was embraced by, you know, the Journal for Pain and Symptom Management, which is a palliative care journal, right? So in other words, like the editors may be less familiar with the actual technique, but because there is so little evidence, they were more willing to accept this study, as opposed to, like, let's just say I did like qualitative interviews that were completely unstructured with specialists. I think the structure that I was able to provides some greater sense of, I think, uniformity to sort of the findings that we were able to generate. And the second piece, and I think this is a really important one that you were kind of alluding to, Carol, which is that most people don't know what a Delphi technique is. And I had one reviewer was like, I don't understand the point of this study. It literally sounds like a perspective piece where you're just getting people's opinions and publishing on people's opinions. And I was like, yes, that is sort of what we're doing, but we're doing it in a structured way because there is literally no evidence about this topic whatsoever. Basically, the reviewer was saying you should use evidence to support your assertions. And I'm like, we can't do that because there is no evidence to support our assertions. So I had to very, very politely respond and educate this reviewer on what is a modified Delphi study, the indications for using this methodology, and yeah, and just making sure that that person knew why we were doing this type of study.
Kudos to you for doing that. Erica, did you want to ask your question?
Oh, I see it. I'll just read it out loud.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Erica. Please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to know if you ever considered doing an in-person round, or if you would do anything different if you had an in-person round, or what you generally think about having in-person sessions for the Delphi study.
Yeah, I think that's totally fine. It's a very feasible thing to include in your modified Delphi study. What I would say is you just have to ask yourself the same questions you would ask, you know, yourself in any sort of research study. It's like, well, why am I doing it, and what are the pros and cons of doing it, right? And you know, I think for us, we had 18 panelists. They all basically lived in different parts of the country. And I think that having like a Brady Bunch situation where you have 18 squares via Zoom and having sort of that kind of exchange of conversations in that format, I think would be especially challenging. I think probably the benefit, like, let's say, for example, you have a national convention of specialists that, you know, a lot of people are going to show up for that. You could basically design your study around that type of event because everyone's going to be there for the same reason. Let's say ASCO, right, which is the American Society for Clinical Oncology, and you wanted to get all of these oncologists' opinions. I think having an in-person sort of meeting at a conference like that as part of your study would make a lot of sense because everyone's going to be there anyway. And, it's nice to kind of get that exchange. But you then have to weigh it with sort of the downside, which is like we kind of pointed out, getting people together is sort of the juice worth the squeeze. And you also just have to ask yourself, like, is there anybody in this panel that I'm worried about is going to just dominate the conversation? And you're basically just going to have, terrible results that result from that. And so again, no right or wrong answer. It's just about just being able to justify your reason for designing your study in that way.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful.
Hey, does anyone have any other questions for Isaac? Great. Well, Isaac, thank you so much for doing this. Go ahead on your conclusion there.
Yeah, sure. So again, as I mentioned, a Delphi technique is a structured method of achieving consensus among experts when there's little evidence that exists on a specific topic. And as we sort of alluded to, reporting Delphi study results are highly variable, but best practices do exist, which is why I would recommend that manuscript that I presented. And so I'm happy to send this to folks, but these are the references that I used today in my presentation. Yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great. I know someone who will reach out, who, as I mentioned, one of the folks who's on service, and I will connect you guys. I also wanted to mention a little bit of news from the Research Design and Analysis Corps on the Dana-Farber side. We have hired a survey methodologist, Mark Sussman, who comes to us from Ohio State, finishing up a postdoc at Vanderbilt. His primary research interest to date has been in misinformation, but he has a good solid skill set. In addition to that, I think aligns well with a lot of the skills that Dan had. And so, but we'll also bring some new skills, and I think it'll be great to have him on board. He's starting mid-May. And so we will introduce him around. We'll have him deeply involved in the partnership.
Carol, I think there was a question by Sarah. Sarah,
Oh, sure.
would you like to ask your question? You're muted, actually. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I was just curious how the results are now influencing your practice and protocols, or if you need to have more evidence in order to support your results.
Yeah, that's a good question. What I would say is I think what our hope was with this was that this publication would then maybe influence the educators within hospice and palliative medicine to then create more specific guidelines around, the educational components of this particular issue. Unfortunately, to date, I don't know of any further changes to sort of how we're teaching our fellows, except I can say that locally within our fellowship program, there is more attention to it, but I think that's more of an influence as far as who we have as like educators and who we have as part of our faculty, because we do have people who focus and do research in these areas, rather than crediting this particular study. What I can say though is that I think now looking back on this study, what it has done is it's kind of just added to just the growing landscape of like creating better guidelines around this topic. So as I mentioned to you before, there have been other modified Delphi studies specifically on this topic, but bigger sample, right? Slightly different questions. And my paper has been cited in those studies. And so it's kind of just like creating a snowball effect. So I do think at the end of the day, if there are more and more of these studies I think there's more and more evidence, more and more sort of guidance around how do you manage these situations with a greater sense of clarity. And so I think in that way, it might influence overall practice in our subspecialty. But to date, unfortunately, I think people have already forgotten about this publication. So, but that's just my thoughts about it.
Thank you.
Okay. There are no other questions, then thank you so much, Isaac. This has been a wonderful presentation and a wealth of information that I'm sure will be referenced many times coming up. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.